In this lesson, we'll learn how to edit an environment light in Photoshop. Now, at the end of the last lesson, we had a look at the first render that came out of our setup that we had done, and we noticed that we had quite a lot of darker spots and lighter spots around our render. So what I wanted to do, instead of trying to increase any render settings, you'll notice that we used very low settings by cutting the subdivision multiplier in half. Noise threshold is quite high, in other words, we should have a lot of noise, and everything is pretty much at its lowest possible point in terms of its render setting. So instead of cranking up render settings to try and blur out any GI, for example, we could go into our irradiance map over here and we could start to increase the interpolation samples to go and blur out some of those blotchy areas, but most of that discoloration that we want to get rid of is actually caused by our high-res HDRI image. If we go into our material editor, you'll remember that we had used one HD or one high-res high dynamic range image for both our environment and our reflection. So what I'd like to do in this lesson is just to open up Photoshop. Now I've flipped over into Photoshop and I'm going to be opening up that image. So let's go to our texture folder and let's open up that HDRI room file. So you'll see here that it is quite a high-res crisp image, and all of these sharp lines and sharp light and dark areas are the reason why we are getting this blotchy result. So what I'm going to do first of all is to reduce the size of the image. So let's go down to image size and let's drop it down to at least 512. Next, let's go to the filter and blur our image. So let's go to Gaussian blur, and we can have between 5 to 10 pixels. It doesn't matter if it's too blurry, it's just the difference between light and dark that we're really looking for. We're not looking for any crisp detail whatsoever. Then let's go and save it out as an HDRI. Remember just to call it a low res blur. Remember to have an extension of .hdr, save it out, and then once you go back into 3D Max, go and find that file for yourself. So let's go and call this one low res blur, and we're going to browse for that file, and that file is now going to get instanced into that slot. So with this setup, let's now go and have a look at the difference. This is the previous image. I'm going to now pause the video, do a quick test render, and let's have a look at what the difference is. So there's our result. I'm showing you now the completed rendered image, and just if we go back to the previous one, you'll see that it is a lot more blotchy. So none of the render settings have changed. The only thing that has changed is the actual render light. And a good way to actually go and test out whether it's your render settings that are causing any blotchiness or your actual HDR image is to start out purely without any lighting or without any texture in your HDR. So just have a plain off-white color for your lighting and do a test render and then have a look at the result. And just for argument's sake, let's go and do that now and see again what the results are. So there we go, that's the plain white render without any HDR image in it. So the HDR is obviously giving it a lot of yellow color, and that is because of the saturation in the image itself. So very often it's a good idea to start out as neutral as possible. In other words, have a medium gray texture for your override material. Don't get anything too brown or too dark or too white especially, and then have a very plain lighting setup to start out with so that you can see what you're doing, because what could happen is that if you have a look at your render and you see that it's too yellow, you may start to overcompensate that with other colors of lighting or changing your materials even, not knowing that it's actually your environment light that is causing that yellow effect. So it's a good idea just to always start from that complete skeleton and then to work your way up very, very slowly towards a completed product. So that's the end of this lesson. All I wanted to show you was the differences between your environment lighting as you do your render setup. And once we turn this back on, we can then go into the next step in the next lesson of just fine-tuning some of the cameras, the lights, and just getting our positioning and setup ready so that we can start modeling directly in the lesson after the next. So that's going to all happen in a moment.